In this chapter, we're going to build a UI for managing suppliers and changing the supplier for a particular product. But before we dive into that, let's make a few changes to the backend. First, let's remove any unused subscribers. Also, as you might remember, we extended the product creation validator and added an additional field. We will rename that field to supplier ID because, as you know, we have established a many-to-one relationship between product and suppliers. Next, we will clean up the code by removing any unused middlewares and imports. We'll also remove any unused resources in supplier service, like logged in customer. Also, let's not forget about removing it from the injected dependencies type. In earlier chapters, we added the supplier relationships to the store product endpoints to extend the product responses with the supplier fields. Now let's do the same for the admin product endpoints. For the admin product case, we just need to add the supplier field to the default admin product relations array. This will ensure that when we hit the admin product's endpoints, the supplier field is included in the response. I will log in as an admin postman and check the admin product's endpoint response. And as we can see here, we have the supplier field. We will also modify the update product endpoint validator to include supplier ID as an optional field. To do this, we will extend the admin post product's product request from the Medusa.js Medusa package. Similarly, we will make the supplier ID field optional in the create product validator as well. Don't forget to register the updated product validator in the API index.ts file. Once those changes are in place, let's test everything Postman. I will log in as an admin, and now let's check the current supplier ID in the product update response. Now, let's pick a random supplier ID from the store suppliers response and update the product with the supplier field using the selected supplier ID. And yes, it works fine. Next, let's uncomment the admin plugin from the Medusa.js config, start the backend, and go to localhost 7001 and log in as an admin. My idea is to add the supplier selection widget on the product details page over here. But first, we need to create a page where we can manage suppliers. That is where we can create and delete suppliers in our store. To begin, we'll create a suppliers folder inside the admin rows and add a page.tsx file. Inside this file, we'll define a component called suppliers list table. And also as a props, it would take the road props from Medusa.js admin. Next, let's export this component by default. Additionally, we will export the page configuration. As a config type, let's use road config, also from Medusa.js admin package. And for the sidebar label, we will name it suppliers. We should also define an icon. For this particular case, I'll be using the Medusa.js icons library. So let's head over to Medusa UI icons library. and click on the icons. I think rocket launch icon is a perfect fit for this. We will import it from Medusa.js icons and add it to the configuration. Next, ensure that the component returns a div instead of a simple string to avoid errors when rendering. And once that's done, we can start the backend server. Now, when we log in, we should see a suppliers button in the sidebar displaying the selected icon and the text that's inside the div. The next step is to create the suppliers table. For this, we'll use the Medusa UI library table component. I will copy an example from the library and paste it into our code base. Let's just copy the component body and paste it in the suppliers list table body. We will then modify the table headers to match the supplier data. For the supplier reference, we'll use the supplier model. The columns will include name, contact person, and the last column will be reserved for actions such as deleting supplier rows. Let's also modify the table cell values. To fetch supplier data, we'll set up a custom hook using useAdmin custom query from the Medusa React package. The first argument for this hook will be the admin backend route, which in our case is suppliers. The second argument will be the query key, and the third one query parameters. Won't be needed for this case. Now let's define a type for the API response, which we will call suppliers list response. The suppliers field will have the type of a supplier model. We will then map this data to populate the table body. The first argument of useAdmin custom query generic would be the query parameters type. In our case, it would be just the record string unknown. And this the second type would be the API endpoint response. In our case, it would be the supplier response. Let's use the data from this hook to populate the table body. Lastly, I have found a useful loading state snippet from the Medusa repo, which I will copy and incorporate for handling the loading state. This is how it looks like on the UI side. To make the table more presentable, I would wrap it with the container component from the Medusa.js UI package. Additionally, I would add title labeled suppliers inside the container. This is how it looks like. Let's also add some top margin to the table for spacing. To style a title, we'll use the text component from the same Medusa UI package and define the weight and size using its component props. This makes the table look much more organized in the admin panel. Next, we'll remove the unused text-write class from the header cell. Now, let's create drop-down action menu for the supplier rows. For this, I would use the drop-down menu component from the documentation, and let's copy this example. I would rename it from drop-down menu to actions menu and move the imports to the top of the file, ensuring everything is correctly imported. Since we are only implementing a delete action, I will remove any unused triggers. Next, I will define an ID prop in the component and use the useAdmin custom delete hook to create a mutation function to delete a supplier. For proper revalidation, we'll use the same query key as defined in useAdmin query key, which in our case is supplier. Additionally, I would add a toast function to the action component props to provide a feedback. We will also define a success callback in the mutation hook to display a toast message saying supplier deleted successfully. Let's also add this mutate function to the onClick handler on the drop-down menu item. Finally, we'll add this actions menu as a table cell instead of feature actions text and pass the required props to make everything functional. Now let's see how it works in the admin panel. Let's delete some supplier, and as you can see here, the whole list of suppliers is getting revalidated. Now I want to define a widget on the product details page that allows us to select a particular supplier. According to the admin widget documentation in Medusa, we can find an injection zone that corresponds with the product details page. In our case, the injection zone is product details after. First, under the widgets folder, I will create a new file and name it productsuppliers.tsx. In this file, I'll define a new component. As props, it will take product details widget props from the Medusa.js admin package. With this, we can extract the correct data from the widget props. Next, we'll define a config object and its type will be widget config, also from Medusa.js admin package. And let's add our zone. In our case, it would be product details after. After setting this up, we'll export the component as a default and return some placeholder text in a div within the component body. Once this is done, when we navigate to the product details page, we should see our component displayed. Now let's visit the Medusa UI library page to look up the select component. We'll copy the example and paste it inside the body of our widget component. Let's import select component from Medusa.js library. And also let's modify the placeholder to something more relevant like select supplier. Next, we'll access the current supplier from the product data provided in the component props. However, we currently see that the supplier type is defined as any. We need to fix this by navigating to the index.tts file and correcting the import's relative paths. After this adjustment, when we go back to the widget file, we will have the proper supplier definition in the data. Now let's import useAdmin update product from the Medusa React package and use it to update the product's supplier. As the first argument of that hook, we should pass the product ID. We'll also add a toast message to notify the user when the product supplier is successfully updated. To fetch all suppliers, we'll use the useAdmin custom query hook. To keep our code clean, we'll refactor the codebase by moving the supplier list endpoint type into a shared types file. Then we'll import the supplier model and fix the relative import paths. Finally, we will import the supplier type into both the suppliers table and our new widget to ensure consistency. Now let's use data from the supplier list endpoint to display all available suppliers. We'll also use the onValueChange handler to keep track of the supplier changes. Currently, the updateProductMutate function doesn't recognize the supplier ID fields extended in the validators of an endpoint. If we look at the Medusa.js package, we can see that the function uses the admin postproducts product request class. To handle this, we will extend the type definition of that class by updating index.ts file and add the supplier ID field to it. Now, as you can see, I can pass the supplier ID as a string, and I will do that. But also when I change the supplier ID type to number, I would get an error type. In addition, we'll add a loading state for the listing endpoint to improve user experience. Let's also import the icon from Medusa.js icons. Finally, let's set a default value for the supplier select using the current supplier variable to pre-populate the field. Also, let's not forget that current supplier could be null. Let's now check if everything is working correctly. Let's change the supplier. And now we should be able to see the supplier change reflected in the JSON body. To improve the layout, let's wrap the whole select with the container component and add a title using the text component that we have used before. We'll also wrap the supplier select field inside the div and apply its submerging to make it look cleaner. This is how the result looks like. Next, instead of placing the supplier list table under the sidebar, we will move it to the settings page. To do this, we need to adjust the folder roles under the admin directory, changing it to the settings. We also should modify the config type to settings config and moving the label and icon into the card object. And also we should add a description. Now, after refreshing the page and navigating to the settings, we should see our changes reflected.